The horizon darkens, not with clouds, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of an era reaching its final hour. Across the city, news feeds flicker in rhythmic pulses, broadcasting a relentless stream of catastrophe. Earthquakes shatter distant foundations. Famine gnaws at the borders of nations. Wars erupt in territories that once knew only the silence of peace. These are the birth pains. On a crowded street corner, a man stands motionless, his fingers tightened around the spine of a worn book. He watches the tide of people surge past him, faces buried in devices, eyes fixed on the pavement, completely oblivious to the shifting currents. He sees the patterns forming in the chaos. He recognizes the cooling of love in the way they push past one another, and the rise of lawlessness. Deception is already moving through the streets like dry brush waiting for a spark. He knows the signs. The man steps back into the shelter of a doorway as the city roar intensifies, knowing that the time of waiting is over. The panic did not end. It was simply redirected. A figure stepped onto the global stage, his presence radiating a calm that seemed to defy the surrounding wreckage. He spoke, and the frantic noise of the city began to dampen. He did not shout, yet his voice carried across every screen and through every speaker, cutting through the static of the ongoing crises. He offered a blueprint for unity, a structured path out of the famine and the war. The man with the book watched from the shadows as the crowd around him stopped their aimless rushing. They turned toward the screens. They listened. The figure promised economic stability, a new system to replace the failing institutions that had left them vulnerable. His authority was absolute, a heavy weight that silenced dissent before it could even be voiced. People began to nod. They lowered their defenses, their faces shifting from fear to a hollow, desperate relief. The transition was seamless. Freedom, once held as a necessity, was now discarded as a burden. They reached out, eager to accept the terms of this new, controlled reality. The man with the book gripped his pages tighter, watching as the world willingly walked into the cage. The new system arrived not with a declaration, but with a quiet, digital finality. Kiosks appeared on every street corner, replacing currency with a biometric scan. The man with the book stood in line, his stomach tight with hunger, watching the people ahead of him press their wrists against the glowing glass. A soft chime signaled their approval, and they moved on, their needs met by the machine. When his turn came, he stepped forward and held out his hand. The scanner pulsed red. A sharp, mechanical voice echoed through the station, demanding the mark. He pulled his hand back, his fingers trembling, and shook his head. The line behind him surged forward, impatient, their faces hardening as they realized the delay. A security drone descended from the ceiling, its lens locked onto his eyes. He turned and pushed through the crowd, but the doors had already locked. The people who had been his neighbors now stepped away, creating a wide, empty circle around him. He was no longer a participant in their world. He was a glitch in their machine. He ducked into a narrow service alley, the cold dampness of the concrete walls pressing against his shoulders. The city lights hummed above him, indifferent to his presence. He was alone, cut off from the flow of food and shelter, forced to retreat into the dark corners where the system could not reach. The sky began to fail. At midday, the sun lost its intensity, shrinking into a pale, sickly disk that cast no warmth. The light turned gray, then a bruised violet. High above, the moon emerged, but its surface bled into a deep, crimson hue. The man with the book looked up from his hiding place as the air grew heavy. Then, the ground groaned. It started as a low vibration. Buildings that had stood for decades began to sway. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete, widening until the foundations gave way. A skyscraper in the distance buckled, its steel frame snapping with the sound of 1,000 gunshots. Debris rained down. The orderly grid of the city dissolved into a jagged landscape of ruin. Power lines whipped through the air, sparking against the wet pavement. People ran, but the earth beneath them shifted, opening fissures that swallowed the road. There was no escape from the tremors. The sky tore open, and the stars seemed to lose their fixed positions. drifting like embers in a dying fire. Deep beneath the fractured surface, the elite scrambled for their vaults. They hauled crates of gold and digital ledgers into reinforced steel bunkers, sealing the heavy blast doors with frantic, trembling hands. They believed their wealth could buy them a reprieve from the collapse. They were wrong. The air inside their shelters grew stale, the ventilation systems failing as the earth continued to heave above them. Their influence meant nothing to the tectonic plates. Their currency was useless paper in a world that had ceased to function. While the powerful choked in the dark, a different kind of gathering took place in the ruins. In the hollowed-out shell of a basement, the man with the book sat among a dozen others. They huddled together, the walls vibrating with the constant, thunderous roar of the city tearing itself apart. There was no panic here. One by one, they opened their books and began to read aloud. Their voices were thin, fragile things against the deafening collapse of the world above. Yet they did not falter. They shared the gospel, a steady rhythm of hope cutting through the chaos. They knew the roar of destruction was not the final word. It was the sound of the old world passing away, the final, violent labor pains of a new reality. The roar of the crumbling city suddenly reached a deafening crescendo, then abruptly vanished. The thunderous grinding of stone and the howling winds were silenced, replaced by an unnatural, ringing stillness. The man with the book looked up, his eyes widening as the darkness above began to fracture. It was not a cloud parting, but the very fabric of the heavens tearing asunder. A single point of white light emerged, brighter than 1,000 suns, piercing through the crimson haze. It expanded with terrifying speed, consuming the blood-red moon and the drifting embers of the stars. Shadows were erased. The jagged silhouettes of broken skyscrapers were washed away in a flood of pure, searing radiance. The King of Kings had arrived, and the darkness that had gripped the earth was instantly, irrevocably shattered. The charismatic figure stood at the head of his legions, his arm raised in a final, futile command. His forces surged forward, a tide of steel and malice attempting to hold the ground against the encroaching radiance. They did not reach the light. As the brilliance touched the front ranks, the soldiers stumbled. Their weapons, forged in deception and fueled by greed, turned to dust in their grips. The heavy armor they wore clattered to the ground, empty shells as the men inside simply vanished, dissolved by the sheer purity of the atmosphere. The charismatic figure opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. His authority, which had silenced nations and commanded global obedience, evaporated. He fell to his knees, his posture collapsing as the foundation of his power crumbled into nothingness. The massive banners and symbols of his regime ignited, turning to ash. The air itself seemed to purge the influence of his reign. There was no prolonged struggle. The forces that had terrorized the world were erased in seconds. The roar of the battle died instantly, replaced by a profound, heavy silence. The man with the book watched from the ruins, his hands trembling as he lowered his gaze. The silence on the battlefield deepened, but the earth beneath it began to groan. It was not the sound of shifting tectonic plates, but the sound of reality itself losing its grip. The ground where the man with the book stood began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. Massive fissures opened, not revealing dark depths, but glowing with a soft golden luminescence. The jagged mountains in the distance softened, their sharp peaks melting into smooth, flowing forms that defied gravity. The oceans receded, the water turning into mist that drifted upward and vanished into the brilliance above. Every structure, every monument, and every remnant of the old civilization began to fray at the edges. Concrete walls turned to sand and blew away in a wind that carried no dust. The sky, once scarred by smoke and fire, smoothed into a flawless, endless expanse. The man with the book watched his own surroundings blur, the familiar textures of the world losing their density. He felt the weight of the old era lifting, the very atoms of the earth surrendering their form to be reshaped. There was no pain in this undoing, only a total, irreversible transition. The scars of history, the dried riverbeds, the scorched plains, and the hollowed cities were wiped clean. The old world reached its final limit and simply ceased to be, dissolving into a shimmering haze. The haze cleared. Where the broken earth had been, a new horizon stretched out, defined by architecture that defied earthly geometry. The man with the book took a step forward, his boots finding purchase on ground that felt like polished gold, solid and warm beneath his feet. Before him rose a city of immense scale, its walls translucent and shimmering with the luster of massive pearls. He walked toward the gates, which stood open, inviting and vast. There were no shadows here. The light did not come from a sun, but radiated from the stones. He reached out and touched the gate. It was smooth, cool, and vibrated with a faint, rhythmic hum. As he passed through, the sounds of the old world were replaced by stillness. He looked around. The streets were wide, lined with trees that bore fruit and leaves that shimmered like silver. He saw others walking, their movements unhurried, their faces clear of the marks of struggle. He stopped and opened the book he had carried through the darkness, but the pages were blank now, their purpose fulfilled. He let the book fall. He continued walking toward the center of the city. Every step felt effortless. The weight he had carried for a lifetime was gone. He reached the heart of the city, where a river flowed, clear as crystal. He knelt, cupped his hands, and drank. Everything that had been broken was whole. Everything that had been lost was restored. The era of mourning had ended, and the eternal peace had begun.